Henzie Toolbox Torre is one of the awesome new lead commanders from the precons from New Capenna. He lets us cast our 4 mana value creatures for their Blitz cost, a new mechanic for New Capenna which gives our creatures haste, but at the end of turn we have to sacrifice them, but we do draw a card off of it. Additionally, the Blitz cost is reduced for each time we've cast him this game. Henzie is essentially a kind of mini sneak attack in our command zone, which is incredibly strong. Our deck is going to be built around this, so we're going to take advantage of this by running a ton of powerful creatures with great ETBs, attack triggers, and death triggers, and take full advantage of this Blitz ability. Now, obviously, to take full advantage of his abilities, we're going to be running a few effects that lets us get around the commander tax that comes with casting our commander multiple times in a game. Specifically, we're going to be running Netherborn Altar and Command Beacon. These are great ways to get Henzie into our hand. If the command text gets too high, we can bring it to our hand and pay it for his regular cost. We're also going to be running Myth Unbound, which straight up reduces our commander tax based on each time we've cast him this game, and also gives us a little bit of card advantage whenever our commander dies. Now, the exciting part of this deck is obviously the creatures we're going to be cheating in with Blitz. For creatures with powerful ETBs, we're going to be running Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Gary's always a super fun effect that lets us drain our opponents and get a ton of life off it, and it also works super well if we have a bunch of black permanents on the battlefield. We're also going to be running Sepulchral Primordial. This creature gets us a creature out of each of our opponent's graveyards. We're also going to be running Corridor the Doom Scourge. He goads all of our opponent's creatures when he enters the battlefield, which is a super great effect for us because it allows us to direct our opponent's creatures at each other rather than us. Solemn Simulacrum is actually really great in this deck, despite being a green deck. Not only does it give a ton of value by ramping us, we can guarantee that he's going to die, so we draw 2 cards off of him, both off of his regular trigger and off of Blitz, and because the Blitz reduces our mana cost by colorless, if we cast Henzie enough times, we can get this down to basically a free spell to ramp us by 1 and draw us 2 cards, which even at 2 mana or 3 mana is still pretty good. Archon of Cruelty is a great effect here. It's super brutal, but it gives us a ton of advantage and is a great creature for us to cheat out. On attack, he not only draws us a card and gains us life, but he forces our opponents to sacrifice creatures, discard cards, and lose life. This effect is crazy strong, and being able to cheat it out with Blitz is super great. Combustible Gearhulk is one that I really like here. It can usually draw us 3 cards, but if our opponents are bold enough to not let us, it domes our opponents for a ton of damage, thanks to the large number of high mana value creatures that we're running in this deck. Inferno Titan is another great target because it has an ETB and an attack trigger, so we're going to get both of those thanks to the haste. It allows us to take out some of our opponent's utility creatures due to the amount of damage we're doing, and worst case scenario, it's always fun to dome our opponents. Noxious Gearhulk, Ravenous Chupacabra, and Druid of Purification are all great creatures that can remove some of our opponent's problematic permanents when they come into the battlefield, and getting a discount on them is always great. We're also going to be running a few creatures that are able to recur stuff both onto our hand and into the battlefield. Young Necromancer and Artisan of Kozilek get us creatures directly onto our battlefield from our graveyard, and the Artisan of Kozilek has the added bonus of having an Annihilator trigger, which is always super great with haste. Timeless Witness is a great way for us to get something directly back into our hand, and we can also reuse her later with the Eternalized trigger. Along with Enter the Battlefield triggers, we're also going to be running some creatures with some great attack triggers to take advantage of the haste that Henzie gives them. Atali is a beast, allowing us to not only cast our own stuff off of our library, but get our opponent's stuff, gives us a ton of value, and considering we're able to make this come out even sooner with Henzie, I absolutely love it here. Scourge of the Throne is great because it gives us extra combat and works super well if we have multiple creatures that have attack triggers on the battlefield, considering we're going to get them multiple times. Hellkite Tyrant is great because it lets us steal our opponent's mana rocks and utility artifacts just in case there's something like a Panharmonicon on the battlefield, we can take it for ourselves. Drakuseth Maw of Flames is great. It lets us do a ton of damage to both our opponents or creatures they control, allowing us to remove problematic creatures or just dome our opponents for a ton of damage. We also have a Tarka World Renderer. At worst, a Tarka is just a 6/4 with double strike, which is still pretty good, but it actually does have a bunch of synergies in our deck considering we're running a fair number of dragons. So we can get even more value off her if we have multiple of them out. Thanks to Blitz, we can always guarantee that our creatures are going to die, so we're going to be running a few creatures with powerful death triggers. Kakusho, the Evening Star, is great because it drains our opponents for 5 and gives us 15 life, giving us a great way to beef up our life total while also harming our opponents. Etsushi, the Blazing Sky, is great because when it dies, it can either ramp us by 3 with its treasure tokens, or it can draw us 2 extra cards, thanks to the impulse draw it provides. Kura, the Boundless Sky, is great because we can make a big creature off of it, or we can draw up to 3 lands. This is super great for letting us hit our land drops, or it can give us some great utility by tutoring up some utility lands like Beseju, or getting us the classic Urborg Cabal Coffers combo straight to our hand. We're also going to be running the All-Star Classic Wormcoil Engine. Not only is it Death Touch Lifelink 6/6 a great attacking creature, it also leaves us 2 great tokens when it dies. For redundancy's sake, we're also going to be running a few additional ways to sneak attack out our creatures, just in case we lose Henzie a few too many times and we're not able to recast him immediately. Ilharg is one of my favorites here because he is not only a self-sufficient engine, allowing us to put our creatures from our hand onto the battlefield, but we can also drop him onto the battlefield with Henzie's ability, so we can get 2 creatures into the battlefield for the price of 1. Of course, this is a Sneak Attack S deck, so we gotta run the classic Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack is great because it definitely costs a lot less than Blitz, but we don't get the card draw off of it. This can be really good in a pinch, and lets us close out the game by dropping a bunch of huge dragons onto the battlefield if we really need to. Finally, I'm also going to be running Felden of the Third Path. Felden's great because we can take advantage of the creatures in our graveyard and not just our hand, making him a super great way to reuse creatures multiple times in a game. Now, of course, like any other commander deck, we're going to be running a healthy suite of ramp to get our plan going as soon as possible. Since Henzie is a 3 mana value commander, ideally we can actually get him out on turn 2. So we're going to be running a fair number of 1 mana ramp sources that also help us fix our colors. Specifically, we're going to be running Birds of Paradise, Elves of Deep Shadow, Ignoble Hierarch, and Utopia Sprawl. We'll also be running a few classic 2 mana ramp spells that are in green. 3 Wishes, Sakura Tri-Belter, and Nature's Lore are all great, and of course because we're in red, we're going to be running the 2 best ritual effects that we have access to, Dockside Extortionist and Jezka's Will. These cards are absolute powerhouses regardless of what deck they're in, so of course we're going to run them here. Finally, we're also going to be running Cloud Key and choosing creatures with them. Specifically, this is great because it lets us reduce our Blitz costs, which we're going to be taking advantage of a lot. On top of the card advantage we already have in the deck, we're also going to be running a few generic draw effects on top of them. Guardian Project and Beast Whisperer are great ways for us to draw cards off of our creatures whenever we cast them. Painful Truce and Knight's Whisper are solid draw effects that can really help us out in a pinch. Corefold and Skull Clamp are great ways to draw additional cards based off of the Blitz trigger. With Skull Clamp, we can attach it to our creature before it dies to Blitz to basically draw 3 cards off of them. And of course, Corefold is great because we can draw cards whenever we lose a creature to Blitz, but also because we're going to be running some incidental sacrifice effects, we'll get even more value off that. And if people let him stick around for whatever reason, he's always a great late game threat just due to how many +1/+1 counters we can build up on him over time. Magus of the Wheel is a great effect because it allows us to wheel away our hand, and it's also super good here because we can take advantage of creature synergies and fill up our graveyard for reanimation targets. One of the limitations of Blitz is that because we're sacrificing our creatures, it's hard to get a good board presence going if we're constantly sacrificing them. So we're going to be running a few effects to get around this sacrifice trigger. We're going to be running Cauldron of Souls and Makaisthean Hollowed. These give Undying and Persist to our creatures, meaning when they die they come right back to the battlefield. This allows us to not only take further advantage of our enter the battlefield triggers, but also lets us keep our big threats for longer. We're also going to be running Sword of Heart and Home. This lets us blink our creatures, getting around the Blitz trigger, but also it ramps us, which is super good, and allows us to take further advantage of our enter the battlefield triggers, so stuff like Dockside Extortionist can get kind of ridiculous with this. Of course, this is a Jund deck. We're going to be running a few Sac Outlets to get a little bit of extra value off of our creatures. And in moments of desperation, this is actually really good for us because it lets us draw the card immediately off of Blitz rather than waiting till the end of our turn. Bowstrider and Viserys here are super awesome because it lets us scry one whenever we sacrifice a creature. Phyrexian Tower, and High Market are super useful because they're Sac Outlets stapled to lands. Greater Good is super awesome in this deck because it takes advantage of some of our really big creatures and turns them into card draw, and fills up our graveyard with a bunch of strong creatures to reanimate. Altar of Dementia can get powerful threats into our graveyard, and if we really need to, in a pinch, we can actually try and mill out our opponents, but that's usually not going to happen. For removal, we're going to be running stuff like Rakdos Charm, Nature's Claim, and Kolaghan's Command. These can deal with some problematic artifacts and enchantments, and Kolaghan's Command specifically is pretty good because it can get us some creatures from our graveyard into our hand. We're also going to be running Beast Within and Assassin's Trophy, which are great because they can deal with any permanent type. Finally, we're also going to be running a few removal spells that are attached to lands. Bojuka Bog, Boseiju Who Endures, and Hagra Mauling are all great because they're removal spells and lands on top of that. We're also going to be running a few board wipes. Fire Covenant is great because we can pay any amount of life that we want into it, dealing with however many creatures we want to. Last One Standing is super strong because it has a really cheap mana cost, allowing us to set up right after our board wipe. And Shatter Skull Smashing is great because it's also a land on top of being a board wipe. Some other great miscellaneous cards we're running are Faithless Looting is super great because we can use it twice thanks to Flashback, and it lets us smooth out our draws and fill up our graveyard. Speaking of graveyard synergies, we're going to be running Chainer Nightmare Adapt. Chainer is great because we're actually able to cast creatures for their blitz costs from our graveyard with his ability. This allows us to get even more value and reuse our creatures that we've already used. Terror of the Peaks is great because it lets us get even more value off of the giant creatures we're playing, allowing us to deal tons of damage to any target. And at worst, this is still a 5/4 flyer, which is super great for closing out the game. We're also going to be running Expedition Map. This is a great way to tutor out lands if we really need to hit our land drop, but specifically we really want to try and search up something like Cabal Coffers or Orborg in order to get that combo going. Of course, the most glamorous part of any EDH deck is the mana base. We're going to be running Balageta Recovery, Takanuma Abandoned Mine, and Agadim's Awakening. These are great ways for us to get creatures from a graveyard into our hand, and is just a good redundant effect to have in our deck. We want to make sure that we can get Henzie out as quick as possible, so we really need to fix our colors. Because of this, we're going to be running 6 of the fetch lands. These are great ways to help us fix, and everybody knows how good they are. We're going to be running the cycle of the Battle Bond lands, Luxury Garden, Spire Garden, and Undergrowth Stadium. These are great essentially dual lands, just we aren't able to fetch them. We'll also be running all 3 of the Shocklands that we have access to, Overgrown Tomb, Blood Crypt, and Stomping Grounds. We're also going to be running Yavimaya Cradle of Growth. This lets us fix our mana for Forest, which is going to be really important, especially in the early game. We're also going to be running the new Ziatara's Prowling Ground from New Capenna, and of course the classic Command Tower. Finally, we're going to be running 4 Forest, 3 Mountains, and 2 Swamps for our basic lands. Check out some more deck techs right over here.